So self-proclaimed democratic socialists seem to be gaining ground within the Democratic Party. First, there was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with her win against the powerful incumbent Joe Crowley. Then there was Andrew Gillum, who won the Democratic nomination for the governor of Florida. Even in races where progressives lose, they seem to be pushing their opponents leftward. More and more Democrats are talking like Bernie Sanders, and we've even seen some embrace the label socialist.
But if we learned one thing from the Obama years, it's that Republicans are going to call us socialists no matter what we do. So we might as well give them the real thing.
Ideologically, the Democratic Party seems to be moving leftward. The response from the right has been relatively clear. If realized, these ideas will bankrupt our nation and impoverish our people, much like what happened in Venezuela.
Problem with socialism, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, at a certain point you run out of spending other people's money. Venezuela, one of the richest countries in the world in the 70s. Now, the average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds because they're starving to death. 90% of the country is living in poverty.
The progressive rebuttal has been a bit contradictory. First, they say that they're not calling for Venezuelan-type policies.
If your rebuttal involves referencing the Soviet Union, Venezuela, or Cuba, you have no rebuttal, because that's a straw man. Nobody in Justice Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, none of them have said, I believe in a post-capitalist philosophy. I support the Venezuelan system. None of them said that. So why are you bringing it up?
Then they go on to argue that socialism is largely incidental to the suffering of the Venezuelan people.
The reality is that Venezuela's economic woes are largely the result of U.S. meddling, and that the policies of Hugo Chavez had many good results for the people of Venezuela before the U.S. sabotage.
I've almost never seen an article about Venezuela in the West that didn't talk about, the socialism doesn't work. Socialism, though, the problem is socialism, right?
Yeah.
But no, that's not the real issue. The real issue is countries that have huge oil reserves, and by the way, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world, which is amazing, never build effective economies.
So what he's trying to do is basically make the argument that these Democrats, if they win, they'll be authoritarian, because that was the operative factor that was the downfall of all of those, communist attempts, is that they were effectively authoritarian. So when you're authoritarian, you take away all social freedoms and you try to maintain absolute totalitarian control. And that's the problem. The problem isn't that we gave people equal opportunity. The problem is that they're effectively authoritarian systems.
The first point is debatable. One of the main problems Venezuela faces is rampant inflation. And this was how Mr. Kulinski said we could pay for Bernie Sanders' agenda.
Hey, dipshit, we control our own currency. So, of course we could pay for it. By definition, we can pay for it. And it doesn't even need to be deficit neutral.
The second point is simply wrong. Socialism is the reason why Venezuela sucks. The other explanations really don't hold up. Consider that Norway, one of the nations they've fallen over, also depends heavily on oil exports. We've seen nations with dictatorial governments succeed economically, and as far as the US sanctions go, enough with the whining. At least that's what Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, said. But okay, if they don't want to own Venezuela, that's fine. What countries do they have in mind?
We're not talking about that type of socialism. We're talking about the kind that's practiced in Iceland, the kind that's practiced in Denmark, Sweden, Norway. I was just in Norway. Everyone is happier in Norway.
On its face, this seems like a pretty strong argument. The Nordic countries are very nice places that enjoy high standards of living. They outperform the United States on many social metrics. The people there are very happy and they treat each other very well. And yes, they do have very large and expensive welfare states. The problem with this argument is that the people who make it have a trivial understanding of how these countries actually work. For starters, they consistently refer to the Nordic states as socialist nations. Do you know who rejects this claim? The people who live there. Here's the Danish Prime Minister pushing back against Bernie Sanders.
I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. The Nordic model is an expanded welfare state which provides a high level of security for its citizens, but it is also a successful market economy with much freedom to pursue your dreams and live your life as you wish.
Furthermore, their argument is based on cherry picking. Do they really want to emulate these countries? Yes, it's true these nations typically have more generous social programs than the United States, but that's not the only difference. Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland all outrank the United States on the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index. Most notably, they have lower levels of business regulation than the US, which is the opposite of what the Bernie types want. Now, is this why these nations outperform the United States? I wouldn't necessarily suggest that. I'm merely pointing out that these things are complicated, and that the Democratic Socialists ignore data that might go against their narrative. In fact, they seem to ignore one very important factor altogether: culture. There are good reasons to believe that the Nordic model cannot be replicated in the United States. Yes, these Nordic countries have very effective public institutions, and this is largely due to high levels of social trust. We can attribute this to the fact that the Nordic countries are relatively small, religiously, ethnically, and linguistically homogenous, and largely culturally isolated. Nima Sanadaji, a man of Kurdish-Iranian ethnicity who emigrated to Sweden as a child, wrote an excellent book titled Debunking Utopia, exposing the myth of Nordic socialism. In this book, Sanadaji argues thoroughly that it is in fact culture that sets these nations apart. He points out that Scandinavian countries have always outperformed the United States on social metrics, even before the Nordic nations built their welfare states. The gap between them narrows the larger the Nordic welfare states get, and the reverse holds true as well. Furthermore, he points out that ethnically Nordic peoples are more successful in the United States than they are in the old country. In other words, culture seems to be the more important variable at play.
So if you really understand Nordic society, is that they have a unique culture, social cohesion, working ethics, etc., that makes their economies be very well functioning. But high taxes, government involved in the economy doesn't work there. It works as little there as it works here.
Given the significant differences between the United States and these countries, there are good reasons to believe that the policies they have wouldn't work nearly as well here. Much to the chagrin of democratic socialists, culture, size, population, demographics, and other factors still matter. Barack Obama, who is sympathetic to the policies of the Nordic countries, actually pointed this out. When challenged on why he didn't handle the United States' banking crisis the way Sweden did, Obama said, "They took over the banks, nationalized them, got rid of bad assets, resold the banks, and a couple of years later, they were going again." So you'd think, looking at it, Sweden looks like a good model. Here's the problem. Sweden had like 5 banks. We've got thousands of banks. The scale of the US economy and the capital markets are so vast, and the problems in terms of managing and overseeing anything of that scale, I think, would. Our assessment was that it wouldn't make sense. And we also have very different traditions in this country. Not only do democratic socialists fail to appreciate that the United States is a fundamentally different nation than the countries they so long for, they also have cartoon ideas of what social programs in these countries are actually like. They fail to acknowledge the costs both in terms of trade-offs and in real dollars and cents, or for that matter, the political viability of implementing them. They genuinely believe that single-payer healthcare will cover more people with higher quality care while also costing less. They keep gloating about this Mercatus Center study, which shows the overall reduction in costs.
And, well, turns out it was one of those things, be careful what you wish for. But they did a study, and it showed that it would actually save money.
And they're not affiliated with the Kochs anymore.
And they're,
But as the author of the study points out, there may be some serious downsides to cutting the reimbursement rates by 40%, which is where the cost savings come from.
So obviously, if you cut payments to providers by 40%, spending is going to go down. We don't know what else would happen. There might be access issues and quality issues and all sorts of things that might happen. We don't even know whether that's plausible. This is not 40% gradually over time, a la some of the changes in the Affordable Care Act. This is 40% immediately in the very first year. Whether that's plausible, I don't know.
It may well be the case that single-payer healthcare is better on the whole than our current system, but it does come with some serious trade-offs. This is a point I've heard made relentlessly by people who actually live in these countries, including those who favor such systems.
But my problem with Bernie's plan is that nowhere in his plan and nowhere in his speeches does he actually say, we'll have a lean, basic, efficient healthcare system for all of your important needs, but we're going to have to rein in our expectations about what healthcare is, because we can't afford to keep spending 17% of the entire economy on it, and you can't just go and get absolutely everything you might always want. We have to start having conversations about death panels. A large proportion of Medicare, and I say that obviously advisedly, a large proportion of Medicare's expenditures go in the final 6 weeks of people's lives. We have to encourage conversations between physicians and hospitals and old people about what kind of care they actually want. This is tricky. I do think there is a naivete on the Bernie side of the aisle about the amount that we can do. If you simply took everything that happens in the American healthcare system currently and extended it to every single American, it would cost an absolute shit ton of money.
For what it's worth, a few states have tried to give it a go with no success. Vermont actually passed it, but failed to implement it because it was too expensive. California Democrats rejected the idea for the same reason, and 80% of voters in Colorado voted against it. Yes, in the abstract, lots of people will tell pollsters that they like the sound of Medicare for all. But would they still like it if it meant raising their taxes and disrupting their current level of care? I'll believe it when I see it. More annoyingly than anything, they always skirt around the question of how they're going to pay for it. Even under the most modest of predictions, doubling all income and corporate taxes would not pay for Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill.
I'm assuming I'm not going to get an answer for the other $38 trillion, but we'll have you back and maybe we can go over that.
When confronted with this, these people always divert attention to the media, accusing them of hypocrisy.
This is not something he does to, Republican candidates, to establishment Democrats, when they decide to spend out the wazoo for different priorities. Because those different priorities are things that Jake Tapper and everybody else in the establishment, they just grandfather in. Tremendous tax cuts for the rich and for corporations, grandfather it in. Bombing, 3 or 4 new countries and spending billions of dollars in the process, grandfather that in. Endless corporate welfare to Walmart and ExxonMobil, grandfather that in.
If you want to suggest that the media didn't sufficiently challenge Republican ideas, I agree. That doesn't magically make Bernie's dream budget solvent. Also, you don't pay for tax cuts. Cutting taxes means the government is taking less of someone's money. Also, the point on the military spending is a canard. In 1957, a time that progressives think of as the golden era of the US economy, the United States spent 9.8% of GDP on defense while our budget ran a small surplus. Today, we spend about 3.1%, and we're currently approaching trillion-dollar deficits. So you do the math on what's causing our debt problem. And of course, there is the crucial distinction to be made here. Everyone agrees that the government has to provide defense. The same is not true for healthcare. This is only a brief overview of the folly of democratic socialism. I could go on, and perhaps at a later date, I will. It may well be necessary. As superficial and unserious as these people are, they seem to be gaining steam. Just because they're peddling bullshit doesn't mean they can't win elections.